I want to bring in Dan Raviv now to talk a little bit more about the importance of this agreement, not just to the U.S., but to the region. You know, Dan, it's obvious that for the Trump administration leading into an election, this is very valuable. This is a win. This is something that you can sort of use to campaign on. But what about some of the other players impacted? Ben talked about the Palestinians. Benjamin Netanyahu had put forth a plan to annex some of the land in the West Bank that Palestinians had hoped to reserve for themselves. That plan is now on hold. Is this a win for the Palestinians?
Anne-Marie, there are so many angles here. You're totally right. Here's where it is kind of a win for the Palestinians, right? There's a tweet just now from the Crown Prince of the UAE, of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed. And he tweets, during a call with President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, meaning the three men were together on the phone, an agreement was reached to stop further Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories. The UAE and Israel also agreed to cooperation and setting a roadmap toward establishing a bilateral relationship. So he's not promising there's going to be tourism and Arabs from the UAE starting to visit that mosque in Jerusalem, as President Trump and his son-in-law Jared Kushner were saying, but there is every possibility that'll happen, and certainly the UAE is telling the Palestinians, we did not abandon you. We don't see Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel. We don't see Qatar. We of course, don't even see Israel's immediate neighbors, Lebanon and Syria. But for Israel, it's apparently a big deal. We have a tweet only in Hebrew from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It says, historic day, and that he'll have more to say in just over an hour. And so I would say Netanyahu and Trump are helping each other. You're right, Israel's prime minister has a lot of political problems. Israel could face a fourth round of elections, maybe within months. And so this makes Benjamin Netanyahu look good, and it makes President Trump look good, like a peacemaker in the Middle East. And those two friends are apparently quite willing to help each other.
So then what does the UAE get out of this then? I recall maybe just a few months ago, maybe less than a few, Benjamin Netanyahu making this announcement that the UAE and Israel were going to be working together in their fight against COVID. And then the UAE came out with this really sort of tepid, lukewarm response, suggesting, oh, it's just private companies that are working together. It's not, you know, the two governments. But things seem to have changed. So what's the United Arab Emirates benefits in what way?
Well, you know, a dramatic decision isn't made until it's made. And so as of a month ago, and maybe as of 2 days ago, the United Arab Emirates was not going to admit it had official contacts with the State of Israel, known as the Jewish state. So many Arab countries refuse to recognize Israel. They often say that until there is some lasting agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, they just cannot do so. But the UAE would love to be America's best friend. The UAE fears Iran. Iran is the main factor here. Brian Hook, who was way off on the left side of the screen and made a few remarks, that really tall man, he in effect said peace between Arabs and Israelis is Iran's worst nightmare. Well, both Israel and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and others would love to give Iran lots of nightmares. And so the UAE feels it's going to really have strong support from America. Mind you, the whole region is wondering whether Donald Trump will be reelected. If they make any big deals that involve Trump, maybe it's not worth it to them if the U.S. changes leadership. But the UAE was willing to take this opportunity right now. By the way, Israel's very useful in technology against COVID-19, against Iran, for better intelligence. The UAE can benefit a lot. Israel gains its legitimacy. Now only 3 Arab nations have recognized Israel, and a peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, a peace treaty with Jordan in 1994. I covered both of those for CBS News. They were happy occasions. And now this, official recognition from the United Arab Emirates. Just those 3.
And so my next question is, for the other players in the region watching this, I asked Ben whether or not there was any official response yet, and it's just happening now. But what do you expect the general response in the Middle East to be?
A lot of suspicion and conspiratorial, supposition as to what's the background deal, right? Who's paying whom billions of dollars? But I think that kind of view actually ignores what President Trump was more than hinting at. What President Trump wants is for the United States to get out of the Middle East, for Middle Eastern countries not to depend on the United States. Trump says we don't need their oil anymore. Trump doesn't want U.S. troops there anymore. He'd like to totally pull out of Syria if possible. And so I think this is all part of what Trump wants to accomplish. Mind you, the advisors who were there in the Oval Office, and you saw 5 men on either side, right, all male. A lot of them have worked on this for a very long time. Some of them, like Jared Kushner, are Jewish and really want peace for Israel and to help Israel. They haven't been hiding that. They say it's good for Israel and the U.S. So the Arab world may be largely suspicious. They always are. But facts are facts. The UAE agrees to diplomatic relations with Israel. Other Arab and Muslim countries might follow along.
And I want to ask you, same question that I asked Ben. The president brought up this idea of the U.S. not needing to be there anymore in terms of energy independence and oil. What are we to make of that?
Yeah, for many years, even as the United States became more independent when it comes to oil and energy, U.S. officials would point out that America's allies still need oil and natural gas from the Middle East. And so there's that need, and previous administrations were very sensitive to the needs of Japan, India, European countries. Frankly, President Trump believes in America first. So he's not going to keep U.S. troops or U.S. involvement in the Middle East, especially after what everyone sees as a disastrous war in Iraq. He's not going to keep U.S. troops and involvement there just for the sake of America's allies. President Trump basically feels that's their problem.
All right. Dan Raviv, thank you. You have given us some context and a good idea of, what this agreement means and why it's so important. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.